Hey guys, before we get into our Tiny Farms episode, I would like to ask the new listeners in particular, and any old listeners who have not reached out to me, I have a couple questions for you. If you want to come to the website and contact me or via our Facebook page, but I'd like to figure out, how did you guys find the Food Startups podcast? Is there anything that you'd like to hear or see? Don't be shy about that. Anything you want to learn, guests you'd like to have on the show, please let us know. And then 3, on iTunes or Stitcher, if you could leave a review. I haven't been good about asking for them. Sometimes I'm lazy, but it's important. I know I need to move up the iTunes food list ranks. So if you could leave a review for our show, I would be more than grateful. We try to give you as much content as we can that's valuable for you and your business. And we never have any advertisements. But if you could leave a review, that would really help the show. All right. Thank you so much. And we are going to start with our interview.
Welcome to the Food Startups Podcast, connecting the opaque world of food startups.
Today we have the CEO of Tiny Farms, Inc., an Oakland, California company developing the supply chain for insects as a sustainable protein source. As you know, I'm a huge insect food supporter, as this is the 3rd interview we've had on the podcast. And Tiny Farms, they're very into data. Like, they use big data techniques to guide the rapid development of controlled environment agricultural system used for farming insects. They have an open source mealworm farm kit, and we're going to talk about that today. His past career includes software engineering at Silicon Valley startup, technical mentorship at Hack Reactor, which is the Harvard of coding boot camps, and a faculty position in England at Birmingham City University, lecturing on automatic identification and data capture technologies. Most importantly, he is number 14 in Shortlist Magazine's Greatest Men You've Never Heard of. Until today, as he's on our podcast. Ladies and gentlemen, meet Daniel Imrie-Situnayake. Daniel, how you doing today?
Hey, I'm doing awesome. Thank you, Matt.
So the accent gives it away. You're not from the U.S. Tell us, where did you grow up?
Yeah, so I grew up in Birmingham in the UK, which is a city that's like about as far as you can get from the sea. Although we famously have more miles of canals than Venice, which is interesting.
Not bragging or anything, but more miles of canal than Venice. And you made a great comparison that it's the Detroit of England.
Right. It kind of was. It's kind of, I don't know. I feel like Detroit's maybe in a worse position now, but like maybe 10 years ago, that was true. Birmingham, I think, is undergoing a bit of a renaissance at the moment, which is a little unfair because I haven't been living there for the past 6 years. But yeah, it's a place that was once glorious and went through a bit of a bad time, and I think is now coming out of that, which is cool.
Have you visited Detroit and seen like the whole startup scene there?
I actually haven't. No, I'd be interested to fly up there and take a look.
You should. So tell us, today you're in the U.S., but let's just say in your early 20s, what were you doing? We mentioned some of it in the intro. What were you doing in your early 20s back in England?
So I guess, I started out from sort of a software background. I did a degree in computer networking and security. So looking at like everything that goes into using computers for security and communication. And as part of that, I ended up learning a lot about this certain set of industrial technologies called AIDC technology. So that's stuff to do with sensing, data capture, things like RFID, barcoding, computer vision. When I graduated, I ended up staying on at my university and lecturing in that stuff for a while. And I guess like from there, I was actually just traveling in the US and met a girl who was staying at the same hostel as me in San Francisco, and we got on very well. And to cut a long story short, we're now married and live here. So, we live in Oakland. So since I've been over here, I've been working down in LA at a startup. I moved up to the Bay Area, worked at a few different companies here. And over the course of that, about 3 years ago, with a couple of friends that I'd made along the way, we started thinking about like starting a company around food and reducing the distance between people and their food. And that was kind of the genesis of Tiny Farms.
Got it. It's really interesting. Now, you guys should check out the blog at tiny-farms.com. And an article that went live last year it's actually about the World Trade Center being rebuilt, but it's kind of a metaphor for, regrowth doesn't always look exactly the same. Like there's only one tower as opposed to two, et cetera, et cetera. And you kind of talk about how today the media is so much bigger. Everything's so much faster with Twitter and social media. And there's kind of a sky is falling mentality. If you watch the news, I never watch the news, read the newspaper because of this, but you point out that there's less problems with hunger than ever before. So I see you as a bit of an optimist. And I think in these types of entrepreneurial paths, like insect farming and alternative energy, things like that, you kind of have to be an optimist. I mean, what's your view of the world right now?
Yeah, I don't know. I say I'm an optimist, but I'm kind of an angry optimist. And like, I have a lot of optimism for the long-term trajectory of the human race, I guess, and like the long-term improvement in the average quality of life for people. But I'm also kind of aware that we're in a time where we're almost slipping back a little bit. We're getting better at some stuff due to technology and efficiency, but in terms of things like equality, we're actually sliding, and there's some quite alarming kind of trends going on in the world at the moment.
Where do you think we're sliding in terms of equality? Well, I guess we need to define that. So please define what you mean by equality, if it's like income disparity or prejudice or what exactly do you mean by that?
Income equality, quality of life, prejudice. I think they're all related. And I think, to be honest, if we had income equality, there probably wouldn't be a huge issue with racism in countries like the US, because if everybody was on the same footing economically, there'd be less reason for tension between different groups of people. I feel like in the world today, we're starting to see this situation where like people's quality of life is improving rapidly, but then the wealth of a kind of select few is like charging ahead at a far faster rate than anyone else. And if historically you kind of look at those situations where that has happened in the past and societies where that is the case today, those are generally societies that are not successful and don't have resilience against kind of big shocks. So if you have a more equal society and you have a society where everybody can kind of work and be able to improve their own life at kind of a similar rate, then you are much less likely to run into trouble when something goes wrong. So I guess I'm kind of optimistic that we're figuring out how to do things better every day. And there's a lot of people putting a lot of work into that stuff. Technologically, there's a lot of cool stuff going on around sustainability and being able to live at scale without destroying the environment quite so badly. But at the same time, I feel like politically things are going a bit south. You think of like what's happened in Russia, where there was this, obviously the fall of the Soviet Union, and then this kind of chaos and optimism for the future and an integrated Russia. And then actually the fact that this huge inequality was allowed to come about, which basically enabled a tiny portion of society to have a disproportionate sway over what happens in terms of policy in that country. And we're now seeing that it's kind of gone full circle and their economy is really fucked again because of inequality, because there was this moment where there was like the potential for things to become more equal and more democratic, but instead of going down that path, things went down the kind of autocratic path instead. And that has had this huge impact on where they are financially and the stability of Europe, really. And I think that's kind of like a good microcosm for what's going on in the world globally. And like, we really need to be careful that we don't create this situation where the fruits of like I can't remember who is it who said that the future is already here. It's just unequally distributed or unevenly distributed. And that is like a huge source of tension in the world. And I think that's something we've got to be careful to sort out. But on the other hand, we're coming up with some really cool ways of doing stuff that are genuinely better than the way things have been done in the past. So, yeah, it's complicated. It's
complicated, yeah. And so, okay, and just really quickly, have you heard of Will Durant?
I've heard the name.
After the podcast, I'm going to email you the links. I'll also put these on the podcast episode page. But he's just, I'm sure you've heard of like Alain de Botton. He passed away, I think, in the 50s or 60s, but he wrote The Lessons of History, The Story of Civilization, The Lessons of Philosophy. And he just kind of talks about cycles, how when income equality, income disparity gets to a certain point, there's a revolution, and then the revolution, then a dictator takes over, and then democracy, like the same cycles repeat themselves. So it'll be interesting to see if we follow the same cycle. I guess I wanted to ask you, Daniel, I guess you are the second you're the second person from the UK on our podcast. We had Tessa Stewart, who is a fantastic author, on here. And we had talked about the US as well, Tessa and I wanted to know your thoughts. You mentioned, can you tell me one thing you really love about living in the US and one thing that you think could be improved upon?
Yeah, so I probably could come up with a list, but I don't know. I feel like for a good example is just what we're doing with Tiny Farms. I think if we were in the UK, this would have been a lot more difficult to get off the ground. And the interesting thing is that it's not because of anything to do with regulations or whether the country's friendly to business. I actually feel like starting a business in the US is an absolute nightmare. Like, you've got 3 different governments to deal with, at least. You've got your city, your state, and the federal government. You've got to make sure everything's sort of filed and permits are done and taxes all figured out for all of those. It's like a huge overhead. Legally, everything's super complicated. You need a lawyer to start a company. Like, from what I've heard in Britain, it's a hell of a lot easier. You can fill in a couple of sheets of paper and you're sorted. That might be wrong, but socially, I feel like the US is just more excited for people who are trying new things. So there's this implicit support generally, not from everyone in the whole population, but I think people kind of root for the new idea and root for the underdog. And if there's someone coming along with a new way of thinking about something, people tend to give them either the benefit of the doubt or they just kind of ignore them a bit. Whereas Britain kind of has this culture of looking down on risk as being childish. And if you want to be an adult, if you want to be a grown up in Britain, and you hear a lot politicians talking about grown-up politics and grown-up thinking in the UK. And there's this idea that to be grown up and to be a legitimate adult, you have to basically just follow this certain track. You aren't going to take risks with things like starting a business. People actually idolize business people in the UK, but the people we idolize, you look at Richard Branson, who's basically a rock star. He's looked at in a way oh yeah, he's this out there dude who's doing all this crazy stuff that no normal person would ever do. Whereas the kind of business people who are idolized in the US, Warren Buffett is basically a person who's kind of taken this route to being incredibly wealthy by doing things in sort of a quite reasonable way. And I think Britain views business as something that's done by these wacky rock star outliers, whereas America views business as something that is done by regular people who are trying to improve their lives. And that's way closer to what it should be. That's sort of the democratization of capital and the kind of multipliers of growth and of wealth that we say capitalism can bring. That comes out and that is unlocked for the average person when the average person feels empowered to take risks and start businesses. And the thing that kind of gets to me a little bit is, if you want to start a business in the UK, if you want to take a risk, at least in the past, it was way less of a risk to do the equivalent thing over there, because if you start a business and it all goes belly up and you run out of money and you don't have a job, you can get support from the government and you're going to have healthcare and you're going to have an income while you're unemployed and while you're looking for another job. And the chance of basically losing everything and living on the street are pretty slim. Whereas in the US, there's this thin layer of basically wealth or thin layer of income between being all right and being absolutely falling off a cliff. And you start a business here, you take a few risks. Next thing you know it, you've got no house, you've got no income, you can't get a job, you're living on the street. And I go outside, I live in Fruitvale in Oakland, which is a pretty basically neglected part of the world. And there's literally people living in a railway signal box on the end of my street. There's poverty here that I have only barely seen when I've visited developing world countries. It is mind-blowing. The fact that people in the US feel empowered to take the kind of risks with starting businesses or starting new social trends or just kind of trying new things when the potential to fall down is so high and the the result of falling down is so like huge. It's kind of impressive, really. But there's no need for it to be that way. Like we should have this like dynamic kind of, I keep coming back to the word risk, but it's like taking a risk shouldn't be that risky. It should be like innovation is risk taking, basically. And if we want to have a society that is highly innovative, we need to provide the infrastructure for people to be able to take risks without there being no chance of recovery afterwards. And I think that's achievable. I think like neither continent, the Americas or Europe, have got the balance right yet, but hopefully we can figure that out.
Wow. No, that's a really interesting answer. One thing that stood out to me, and I'd never heard this before, but saying that paperwork-wise, it's easier to start a company in the UK versus the US, but the social stigma, right, and the mentality is so prohibitive that it's way better to start a company in the US. I also wanted to comment on what you're saying. There's a book called The Entrepreneurial Imperative. You know, I haven't read it. I've only read like the back of the book and seen reviews of it. But for me, it's enough. But it kind of reconfirms my belief that if you want to help against equality, you need great entrepreneurs and small businesses and innovation. And also for the U.S. as a country, right? It's really important that we have all these new small businesses starting up because we don't really have advantage against, let's say, China and in education, in resources and money. We're loaded with debt, right? But the entrepreneurial spirit of the U.S. and I think half of Silicon Valley startups are founded by people that were not born in the U.S. So is there something about the entrepreneurial spirit in the U.S. that's really conducive to all that type of stuff?
Yeah, it's crazy as well because you think back, like I'm from Birmingham. Birmingham was the Silicon Valley of like 150 years ago. It was the place to be if you wanted to start something involving new technology. And like, it really kind of rewrote history in a way that Silicon Valley has, but not to such a degree. Like the innovations that happened back then were like the kind of innovations that meant that we went from an agrarian economy to an industrial economy. And like now we have a tech economy, but the real economy is a lot bigger than the tech economy. And so like, how did it go from being this place where new ideas were being generated feverishly and commercialized and these like new ideas sort of swept across the world? Like, why did that stop? Why is Facebook an American company? Why do companies come to Silicon Valley to get started instead of Britain? Or even like, I mean, there's vibrant kind of startup economies in other places in the US and like New York and like Boston. But if you talk to people who kind of lived in those places, they're definitely more conservative in risk, I guess, back to that word, than people are in California. And so it's just kind of a different way of thinking about things. And if you can figure out like, why is it that you can come to California and do this crazy stuff and people listen to you and give you like support and guidance, and you can literally get introduced to a stranger by someone who was also a stranger recently, and that stranger will spend 3 hours on the phone with you, helping you figure out how to do something that you were confused about with your business. Like, why does that kind of exist here and not in other places? If you can figure that out and reproduce those conditions elsewhere, like that's how to be successful as a society, I think.
Wow. So that's a really deep thought and changing the way a society thinks. Yeah. I wish I had those answers because I think you're right. I do think you're right. And Daniel, I want to say one thing. So, okay, I don't know if you know who Muhammad Yunus is from Bangladesh.
I don't actually.
Okay, he's won the Nobel Prize like multiple times. He basically started Grameen Bank, and you've probably heard of Kiva.
Yeah, of course.
Okay, they're based on his concept. He actually created a for-profit bank based on the idea that if people can live for less than $1 a day, which is a very, very high percentage of the world population, that they have some innate skills and they're definitely entrepreneurs. So they kind of, they don't have access to loans from banks. They only had access to loan sharks, which is horrible. And so anyway, so his philosophy, he's really made it change the way people think about entrepreneurship. So I think it's worth noting that, he's one of the guys that has changed for a lot of people, inspired tons of people. And they're in multiple countries right now. I also want to say one thing. So he also talks about incentives, right? A lot of at least U.S. volunteer work abroad is people going and giving like lectures or gifts to people. And you talked about England getting like social security, like you fail as your business and you have this like, I don't know, you get 1,500 pounds a month or whatever it is to live off of. The fact that the US, I mean, we do have welfare, but it's not nearly as high, I know, as anywhere in Europe, at least like UK and especially like Scandinavia. I almost see that as a positive because, you know, like when you know that you could be on the streets, you have this motivation. You don't have a blanket to fall back down on.
I see that. That's like a kind of seductive but wrong idea, I think. And the evidence I provide to support that claim is that if you look at who is starting startups in Silicon Valley, it isn't people who were in the military and like left and didn't have sort of transferable skills and decided to start business instead. It's people who went to Stanford and their parents are rich and they have the best safety net you could possibly have.
But Daniel, can I just give you two examples though? But Claude of Noble Brewer Beer, he was in the Navy and he started the beer company.
I'm not going to say there aren't those people because I've met them and they're fantastic people. One of our advisors is one of those people, but it's just that the vast majority of people in Silicon Valley come from a wealthy background. And like I do too, like I went like not a wealthy background, but I'm from like a comfortable middle-class background. Everything is easier. And it's in a way that you just don't even think of. Like I know whatever happens in my life, whatever crazy things that I do, if I lose all my money and I need to go home and cry to mom and dad, I'll be able to live in my old bedroom in my house that I grew up in. And that just isn't true for a lot of people. And I think the rate of entrepreneurship is higher in people who have that background because you know that you aren't really at risk. So maybe, and actually this is a horrible, cynical thing to say, but maybe the reason that entrepreneurship is successful career path in the US is because you don't have the tax burden of exploiting people who are worse, of supporting people who are worse off than you. Maybe that is the secret. I'd hate to think that is true because that's horrible, but I don't think that having a social safety net means that you're not going to be starting a business. I think that it's much more nuanced than that.
Well, Daniel, I got to say, I really appreciate your perspective here because I can tell you if I got in a room with like 4 or 5 of my friends that are like American entrepreneurs, none of us would have your opinion. So it's really, it's just something I've never thought about before. And it's one of those things I'm going to have to like take in and consider when I rethink these, because I kind of automatically defaulted. Okay, it's bad that in Scotland and other places, they get all these subsidies just for not working, not having the motivation. And I still think there's something there about being motivated to work. But you're right. I mean, yeah, there's exceptions here and there, like the founder of WhatsApp and everything. But in general, yeah, you're right. They usually are still the same types of people that go to law school or work on Wall Street. There's no doubt about it.
Yeah, okay. And it's kind of comes to this like thing of why are unpaid internships bad? And on the surface, it's like, oh, that's awesome. A company can have someone come and do some stuff for them and the person gets to learn and that's sweet. It sounds like a mutually beneficial arrangement. But actually, an unpaid internship is something that only wealthy people can take. And that's the kind of like disadvantage that people have that is kind of invisible to everyone else. But if you are from the kind of background where you can't afford to take off a month and not earn any money, then you're kind of screwed. So it's interesting to think about these kind of obstacles people have.
And Daniel, I have to mention this. Have you heard of this was like a blog that I think like right before you got to the US came out. Have you heard of this? It's like a parody called Stuff White People Like.
Yeah,
and number 105 is unpaid internships. And it's you'd love this. You gotta check it out, man. All of their, but it just makes fun. It's kind of more like the emo hipster, kind of very super liberal white guy, like threatening to move to Canada. All these really like liking soccer, all these kind of things like that. And you just got to read it, and I'll link it for readers as well. But it kind of makes fun about all these things you're talking about, like a comedic way.
Interesting stuff. I think like the thing that really showed that to me was when I first met my wife. She was working down in LA, like trying to break into the film industry, and the film industry is like the ultimate like example of this, because basically you just work for free for years and eventually maybe you'll start getting paid work. But the vast majority of people come in and just work for free for a while until they give up, and then like go and do something else. And it's kind of tragic, really.
Yeah, and you've been to LA, you've lived in LA, so they used to all be waiters, and now they're driving Uber. They're like Lyft and Uber drivers. You take a Uber, and they're like, "Yeah, I got a pilot next week, but I've been here for 7 or 8 years." And yeah, I mean, it's not easy becoming an actor.
Yeah, when there's a lot of people who want to do something, you basically can get exploited by employers. That's the truth of it.
Okay, great. So Daniel, I think this is a perfect time to segue. I want to talk a little bit about your philosophy and with Tiny Farms. So, and Daniel's blog, which he updates periodically, is great because I kind of feel like you're trying to be, because you're working on open source stuff. So you don't necessarily have competitors. You'll mention, all of the big, cricket protein suppliers and brands and stuff. You're kind of trying to bring everybody together because you mentioned that in your most recent post. I want to know, using big data, right? You're definitely very, you understand a lot about technology, right? And maybe some types of like modeling. You want to use big data techniques to guide the rapid development of controlled environment agricultural systems. When you say controlled environment, I think like you can do it in your house. It can be urban. I could be wrong there. Used for farming insects. What is, we've talked about all these big world issues. And so apply that to what you're doing with Tiny Farms.
Cool. Yeah. So I guess we can sort of start back where we started as Tiny Farms. So we were looking at, and our team is awesome. We're basically kind of refugees of Silicon Valley art and design and technology. And we're kind of looking at what can we do to build something that will let people be closer to where their food is produced. And so to begin with, we started looking at like products that would, like you said, let people grow food in their own home, or maybe like kind of at a local level, but in an automated way using technology. And that's something that's really exciting for a variety of reasons. But like, I think the thing I find most exciting about it is it like de-anonymizes the source of your food. We think of food as just being something you get from the grocery store. That's kind of a cliche. That really is the same. That really is kind of a quite fundamental thing. Like, imagine you would probably be less inclined to drive a big truck if you had every day like a video streaming of the damage that fracking is doing to Alberta's tar sands or whatever. That's not going to happen. I doubt that people are going to start caring about gas, but food is different because we can kind of enjoy that experience of growing food and also develop that awareness at the same time. So it's kind of cool. But we were looking at like, could you grow like vegetables at home more easily and that kind of thing. And as we were looking at that, we kind of ended up noticing this, what we thought at the time was like a little community of people experimenting with farming insects for food. And we thought it was really kind of fascinating. And we jumped in and started like meeting some of these people and talking to them. And we realized really quickly that this wasn't just a few niche kind of tinkerers. This was like the tip of an iceberg that represents like decades of researchers, institutions, sort of independent inventors and entrepreneurs all working together to try and get people to think about, why don't we eat insects in the West? And the reason we don't eat insects in the West is basically that Western countries don't really have naturally particularly big insects. And so we never got around to bothering to collect thousands and thousands of tiny little bugs to make a meal.
Sorry, I just want to interrupt here just because it's really relevant. Because I've asked my two previous guests, how are we going to get over the social stigma that some people think insects are gross? And this is a new thing that I've never heard before. You think it's because of the small size generally of our insects?
Yeah, I mean, so this is kind of my favorite, like, it's not my theory, but it's my favorite of the theories about why people in the West don't eat more bugs. And it's because basically there aren't that many bugs worth eating around. Like the bugs that we have in the West in large numbers are kind of gross. Like you don't want to be eating the fly that landed on your sandwich or the cockroaches that are lurking in your like bathroom or whatever. So we didn't kind of have that thing historically, but lots and lots of people eat insects, like billions of people eat insects, like all around the world, and all different kinds of insects. And it's just like ridiculous in this age where we almost like fetishize new food to the degree that like people are taking a mac and cheese and remaking it with like all this crazy stuff. Why bother making 50 different variants of mac and cheese and selling them in food trucks all around California, when there's like literally entire categories of animal out there that we have never tried to eat, and they are available in abundance and people love eating them worldwide. So as someone who just loves food generally, that kind of really appealed to me, and like the same for my co-founders, I think. And we just started to realize this was a pretty big deal. And so we started figuring out, like, how do you grow insects? Does it make sense for them to be grown at home in a kind of home domestic system that could provide the insects you need? And we've seen some interesting experiments and thought experiments from people around like potential products like that. We've also thought about, like, can you do this at a large scale, and what would an insect economy look like? And in fact, there are countries where there are insect economies. There's Thailand, which is probably the most sort of developed in terms of the way that the insect economy works. There's like thousands and thousands of cricket farmers. There are middlemen who buy the crickets, take them to market. There are supermarkets that stock frozen insects kind of ready to cook with, all that stuff. So this exists out there, and it's not that crazy. And so we started thinking about what role we could play with our backgrounds. And we kind of quickly realized that the big problem in the space, talking to people who are developing products using insects, is actually that there are not very many insects that are food grade that you can buy. And when we got started a few years back, this was like even more true than it is now, but it's still absolutely like the biggest issue for this industry is not that people are not accepting of eating insects. It's that there aren't enough insects to make enough products for all the people who want to buy them. And that might be surprising to some listeners, but like, one of the things that's actually makes it easier to start a company in America is that there is this gigantic market of hundreds of millions of people. And even if just a tiny fraction of those people were open to trying new things, then that's still a damn lot of people to sell your product to. But fortunately, there is a lot of open-mindedness in this country, especially around food. And so this quite big problem that these people are out there building products using an ingredient, but the ingredient is not widely available. And so we decided to try and solve that problem. And while exploring that space, we looked at whether the big farms or the small farms made more sense. And we built farms, we built small farms, we built big farms, and we tried to figure out what works best to get those insects out there, and at a price that it makes sense to be including them in products. And so what we hit on was that small scale insect farming is fantastic, and there's a huge potential for that to be a big source of income and a big source of nutrition for a lot of people around the world. But if we want to have cheap insects, we need to have large scale automated production, because we really need insect protein to be comparable with other sources of animal protein, or even comparable with vegetable proteins, for it to be economic, for people to decide, I'm going to have the insect food product rather than eating this beef jerky. And so all the stuff that we started to figure out about small scale farming, we realized, oh, wow, this is kind of cool. We should package it up and give it away. And that's what our Open Bug Farm project is. It's our way of, when we come up with some technique that works really great at small scale, we can release it through Open Bug Farm. People can start using it, experimenting with growing insects. If you are running like a research project in the developing world, there are quite a lot of them looking at growing insects to improve people's economic and nutritional security. Rather than reinventing all this stuff every time, you can just go to Open Bug Farm and look at what we and our community have figured out and use that. On the other hand, and the kind of main focus of what we do is figuring out how to do this at scale. How do we catch up with the poultry industry, which has staggering efficiency, but at a huge cost in terms of ethical treatment of animals and in terms of environmental impact? So these guys like Tyson, they're amazing at converting poultry feed into chicken, which is then available for you to buy at very low cost in supermarkets. How do we compete with that with insects, but in a way which means that we're not going to be feeding all of our animals with antibiotics or treating them in ways that makes them violently peck each other to death and all this horrible stuff that you learn about as you dig into how our food system works. And so the big focus of our company is like, developing this technology for farming insects at scale using automation and technology, and then scaling that up so that it's not just our farm or the handful of insect farms that exist at the moment, but it's like a nationwide or worldwide network of farms, which are all kind of able to pull resources together to do the research and development that we need to be able to sustain the increase in efficiency over time.
Right. So
yeah, that's kind of what we're doing.
Wow, Daniel, that sounds amazing. I think it's really cool. I definitely, at the very least, want to tweet any new articles you write on your blog, because it does seem like you guys are really trying to be I love how you're doing open source. You can help other people out, and I'd like to hear your developments as you guys continue. Well, listeners, today was an amazing episode. You can find everything online at foodstartupspodcast.com/tinyfarms. And Daniel, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Oh yeah, thank you, Matt. It was a pleasure.
Hey guys, thanks so much for listening. And as always, if you have any questions or comments, find us online at foodstartupspodcast.com.